Poland and elsewhere, museums that commemorated the heroic anti-fascist resistance were closed down, and monuments to the struggle against Nazism were removed. In countries like Lithuania, former Nazi war criminals were exonerated. Some were even compensated financially for the years they spent in jail. The first president of the anti-communist Czechoslovakia and later president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, another guy who was adored among some of the academics here, he took personal ownership of public properties that had belonged to his wealthy family 40 years before. Havel, the man of peace, sent Czech troops into the Gulf War, into the war that killed 100,000 Iraqi civilians. Havel sent arms to the fascist regime in Thailand. Havel voted with the United States to condemn human rights violations in Cuba, but he's never uttered a word of condemnation of human rights in El Salvador, Colombia, Guatemala, Indonesia, Thailand, and any other U.S. client state. Havel, the great Democrat, signed a law that made the advocacy of communism a felony with a penalty of up to 8 years imprisonment. He signed another law barring communists and former communists from employment in all public agencies. Havel warned labor unions not to involve themselves in politics. Some militant unions had their property taken from them and handed over to compliant company unions. In the Czech and Slovak republics, former aristocrats or their heirs were being given back all the lands and estates they had held before 1918 under the Austro-Hungarian autocracy. Prince Franz Joseph lives, including, by the way, all the new homes that were built on these lands. In Latvia and Lithuania, communist leaders have been tortured and imprisoned for protesting free market inequities. Some are held without any trial. When Estonia held its first free election, in quotes, in 1992, 42% of the population were disqualified from citizenship and prohibited from voting because of their Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Jewish antecedents. Oh, the flowering of democracy works its wonders in mysterious ways, especially in the free market. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was preparing for its fatal plunge into the free market paradise, Bruce Gelb, who was head of the USIA, told a reporter that the Soviets would benefit from U.S. business education because, quote, the vipers, the bloodsuckers, the middlemen, that's what they need. That's what needs to be rehabilitated in the Soviet Union. That's what makes our kind of country click. Quoted in the Washington Post, Bruce Gelb, one of the leading intellectuals of the Republican Party. The vipers and bloodsuckers have arrived in Russia, Eastern Europe, and China. Consumer goods are more abundant than ever. Thousands of luxury cars are on the streets of cities like Moscow and Prague. Rents and real estate prices have skyrocketed. Stock exchanges have sprung up all over China, Russia, and Eastern Europe. A new class of investors, speculators, and racketeers are wallowing in wealth. And with that accumulation of wealth comes, with the enrichment of the few comes the impoverishment of the many. The professed goal in these countries is no longer to provide a better life for everyone, but to improve opportunities for individuals to pursue personal gain and amass great fortunes. So what has this brought for the many? A dramatic rise in unemployment, homelessness, drug addiction, air and water pollution, tuberculosis, cholera, polio, prostitution, teenage rape, child abuse, and just about every other social ill. Beggars, pimps, dope pushers, and other hustlers ply their trade as never before. In countries like Russia and Hungary, the suicide rate has climbed 50% in a few years. There's been a decline in nutritional levels and a sharp deterioration in health. 1/3 of Russian men now never live to the age of 60. The death rate has risen nearly 20% for East German women in their late 30s, and nearly 30% for men of the same age. In contrast, where communist governments are still in power, Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam, death rates continue to fall, according to that communist publication, the New York Times. That's where I got that one. Prominently displayed on page 24A, on the lower left-hand side in the deep, it was the 26th paragraph of a long article. Occupational safety is now almost non-existent, and workplace injuries and deaths have drastically climbed. In China, there are workers who now put in 12 to 16 hours a day for subsistence pay without regularly getting a day off. The market reforms in China have brought a return of child labor. See, that's why U.S. leaders like China, but they don't like Cuba. You hear these people say, well, we're friends with China, but we're still hostile to Cuba. How irrational. Just because you don't understand the policy doesn't mean they don't understand it. The key is the relationship of capital to labor. And in China, labor is being imprisoned. And in China, capital has been unleashed in its rawest, most vicious free market way. And that's not true in Cuba. In Cuba, nobody works 12 to 14 hours a day. In Cuba, the human services haven't been cut back. And that's the problem with Cuba. That's where Cuba still has to reform. In Eastern Europe and Russia, worker vacation resorts, clinics, cultural centers, daycare centers, and other features that used to make communist enterprises something more than just workplaces, they have just all about disappeared. Worker rest homes have been redone as gambling casinos and nightclubs for the nouveau riche. School lunches, which were once free or very low priced, are too costly for many pupils. Hungry children now constitute a serious school problem. After only 1 year of its free market paradise, Russia saw its consumer spending drop almost 40%. Now, just to give you what that means, in the Great Depression, in the first 3 years, it took 3 years, in the first 3 years, consumer spending dropped 21% over 3 years. Now here, in 1 year, you had almost actually more like 38 point something percent. In the former communist countries, 70 to 85%, it varies from country to country, 70 to 85% now live below or not far above the poverty level, many of them in absolute economic desperation. The eastern countries are also, and this may be one of the most significant points, they also are being recolonized by Western capital. The pattern of trade is becoming third world. If you look at third world countries, you find they do very little trade with each other, even right next door. All their economies are geared to the West, extracted from the West. That's exactly what's happening now in Eastern Europe, where there used to be an enormous trade between the various Eastern European and Soviet Union countries. There's very little trade between them now. Almost all of it is with the West. The West has come in and has pretty much taken over. Multinational corporations are moving into Russia to exploit the vast oil, gas, and mineral reserves with enormous profits, and little benefit going to the people. Big private companies will enjoy easy loans, cheap labor, speed-ups, broken labor unions, and no taxes. It's the third world all over again, ladies and gentlemen. U.S. timber interests, with the financial support from a venture fund sponsored by the Pentagon, our tax money, are preparing to clear-cut the Siberian wilderness, a region that holds 1/5 of the planet's forests and is the habitat of rare species. And this is being done over the protests of U.S. and Russian environmentalists. Private investment has brought a decrease rather than an increase in production. Understand that. State enterprises are being driven into bankruptcy as private investment comes in. In the Czech Republic, nearly 80% of all enterprises have been privatized, and most of them have been decapitalized. They've been rubbed out, in effect. Industrial production shrank by 2/3. In Poland, with privatization, production has shrunk about 1/3. In Macedonia, one of the breakaway republics of Yugoslavia, a labor representative noted, quote, "Privatization seems to mean the destruction of our companies. Macedonians complain about how work has taken over their lives. One has no time to care about others. There's no time even for oneself, only time for work and for making money." That was on the PBS report. Thousands of cooperative farms have been forcibly broken up over the protests of their members. Agricultural output has consequently plummeted in these countries. The new private farmers find they can't produce for a commercial market. They're unable to get loans or seeds or machinery. They're rapidly losing their holdings, or they're reverting to subsistence farming. Hungary's agricultural cooperatives, which by the way was one sector